The bells did not stop. Day after day, they rang across London, marking deaths faster than the city could reckon with them. Parish records struggled to keep pace. Graves were opened before the soil above earlier burials had settled. In narrow streets thick with the sounds of carts and cries, the living moved cautiously past doors marked by sickness, knowing that survival was no longer certain, only temporary. By the summer of 1564, London faced a crisis that exposed the limits of its institutions, its understanding of disease, and its capacity to care for its own. Mid-16th century London was a city in transition. Its population had been steadily rising, driven by migration from rural areas and the slow expansion of trade. Timber-framed houses crowded tightly along winding streets, many built over open drains or near stagnant water. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Waste was often thrown into the streets, or admixed with animal remains in runoff. In such conditions, disease was not an occasional disruption but a recurring presence. Outbreaks of plague had struck England periodically since the 14th century. The memory of earlier epidemics lingered in both official policy and public fear. By 1564, Londoners were familiar with the term plague, though their understanding of its causes remained limited. The dominant explanations ranged from corrupted air to divine judgment. Preventive measures reflected these beliefs. Fires were lit to cleanse the air, and households burned herbs or carried fragrant substances in an attempt to ward off illness. The early months of 1564 did not immediately signal the scale of what was to come. Deaths occurred as they often did in a city of growing size, and while officials tracked mortality through parish records, there was no centralized system capable of rapid response. It was only as spring turned to summer that the pattern became undeniable. Weekly death counts began to rise sharply, and the increase was not confined to a single parish. As the disease spread, it moved through the very structures that defined urban life. Crowded housing facilitated transmission. Families lived in close quarters, often sharing beds and limited space. Once illness entered a household, it was difficult to contain. Servants, apprentices, and extended family members all became vulnerable. The movement of people through markets, workshops, and places of worship further accelerated the spread. Authorities attempted to impose order on a situation that was quickly exceeding their control. One of the primary responses was the isolation of infected households. When a case was identified, the house might be shut up, with occupants confined inside for a period of weeks. Watchmen were sometimes stationed outside to enforce the restriction. While intended to prevent further spread, this measure often created additional hardship. Those confined faced shortages of food and care, and in some cases, multiple members of a household fell ill without access to assistance. Trade and daily commerce began to falter as fear reshaped behavior. Those who could afford to leave the city often did so, seeking refuge in the countryside. This departure included members of the court and wealthier citizens, reducing the capacity of the city's leadership at a critical moment. For those who remained, economic activity slowed. Markets saw fewer buyers. Workshops closed or operated at reduced capacity. Labor shortages emerged as illness and death affected workers across trades. The burden on parish systems became increasingly visible. Parish clerks were responsible for recording deaths, organizing burials, and maintaining local order. As mortality rose, these tasks multiplied beyond manageable levels. Burial grounds filled quickly. In some areas, new pits were dug to accommodate the dead, not as a reflection of disregard, but of necessity. The pace of death meant that traditional burial practices could not always be observed in full. Religious life adapted under pressure. Churches remained central to community identity, but gatherings carried risk. Some clergy continued their duties despite the danger, providing last rites and comfort to the sick. Others were themselves lost to the disease. Sermons often interpreted the outbreak through a moral or spiritual lens, encouraging reflection and repentance. At the same time, practical concerns such as limiting large assemblies began to influence how religious services were conducted. Medical responses in 1564 were constrained by the knowledge of the time. Physicians operated within frameworks that emphasized balance within the body, often prescribing treatments intended to restore harmony among bodily humors. These treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of herbal remedies. While some practices may have offered limited relief, none addressed the underlying cause of the disease, which would not be understood for centuries. Apothecaries and surgeons also played roles in the response, preparing compounds and attending to the sick. Demand for their services grew, but so did the risks they faced. Without effective means of protection, many who cared for the ill became victims themselves. The line between caregiver and patient was often short. Information moved slowly and unevenly through the city. Without modern communication systems, news of the outbreak spread by word of mouth, official notices, and the visible signs of illness and death. Markings on doors, the presence of watchmen, and the sound of bells all served as signals. These indicators shaped public perception, reinforcing awareness of the crisis while also contributing to fear. Efforts to regulate movement were inconsistently enforced. City authorities issued orders intended to limit gatherings and control the flow of people, but compliance varied. Economic necessity compelled many to continue working, even in risky conditions. For the urban poor, the choice to stay home was often not viable. Survival depended on daily labor, and the absence of income could be as immediate a threat as disease. Charitable institutions and informal networks provided some relief. Alms were distributed, and neighbors sometimes assisted one another with food or care. However, these efforts were uneven and could not fully compensate for the scale of need. The strain on resources became more apparent as the outbreak persisted. By late summer, the mortality rate reached its peak. Parish records from this period show a sharp escalation in weekly deaths. The cumulative toll reflected not only the spread of disease but also the limitations of the city's response mechanisms. Burial practices adapted further, with increased reliance on mass interments. The urgency of managing the dead was matched by the ongoing struggle to care for the living. The experience of the plague was not uniform across London. Some areas were more severely affected than others, influenced by population density, economic conditions, and patterns of movement. Wealthier districts, while not immune, often had greater access to resources and the option of temporary relocation. Poorer neighborhoods, with tighter living conditions and fewer means, bore a disproportionate burden. As autumn approached, the intensity of the outbreak began to diminish. The reasons for this decline were not fully understood at the time and remain complex. Seasonal changes may have played a role, as did the reduction in susceptible individuals within heavily affected areas. The gradual easing of mortality allowed the city to begin the process of recovery, though the effects of the epidemic would linger. The aftermath of the 1564 plague revealed both resilience and vulnerability. Economically, the city faced disruption. Businesses that had closed needed to reopen, and labor shortages affected productivity. In some cases, wages rose due to reduced workforce availability, altering local economic dynamics. At the same time, households that had lost primary earners struggled to regain stability. Socially, the epidemic reshaped community structures. The loss of family members, neighbors, and local leaders created gaps that could not be easily filled. Parish communities worked to re-establish routines, but the memory of the outbreak influenced behavior and attitudes. Awareness of disease and its impact became more deeply embedded in the urban experience. Politically, the events of 1564 underscored the need for more coordinated responses to public health crises. While immediate reforms were limited, the accumulation of such experiences contributed to evolving approaches in later decades. Record-keeping practices improved over time, and authorities began to place greater emphasis on monitoring and intervention during outbreaks. The plague also reinforced existing beliefs while gradually challenging others. Interpretations rooted in religion remained influential, but repeated epidemics prompted increased attention to environmental and social factors. Observations about overcrowding, sanitation, and movement began to inform practical measures, even if the underlying mechanisms of disease transmission were not yet understood. In the broader context of English history, the 1564 outbreak was one among several significant epidemics, but it held particular importance for London's development. The city's growth continued in the following decades, accompanied by ongoing challenges related to health and infrastructure. Lessons drawn from repeated crises contributed, over time, to changes in urban management and public policy. the human dimension of the epidemic remains central to its significance. Behind the numbers recorded in parish registers were individual lives, each affected by the circumstances of the time. Families adapted as best they could, balancing fear with the demands of daily existence. Acts of care and responsibility persisted alongside loss, reflecting the complexity of life during a period of sustained crisis. By the end of 1564, London had endured one of its most severe outbreaks of the century. The immediate threat receded, but the conditions that had enabled the epidemic, crowded living, limited sanitation, and incomplete understanding of disease, remained. Future outbreaks would occur, testing the city again and again. What the events of that year demonstrated with clarity was the relationship between urban life and vulnerability. As London expanded, the benefits of growth were accompanied by risks that required new forms of management and awareness. The plague of 1564 did not transform the city overnight, but it marked a moment when the pressures of population, environment, and knowledge converged with profound consequences. In the years that followed, the memory of the outbreak informed both policy and perception. It served as a reminder of the limits of existing systems and the need for adaptation. Though the scientific understanding necessary to fully address such diseases lay far in the future, the experiences of 1564 contributed to a gradual process of change. The bells eventually fell silent, but their echo remained in the records, in the altered rhythms of the city, and in the collective memory of those who lived through it. London continued to grow, to trade, and to rebuild, carrying forward the lessons of a year when death outpaced burial, and the city was forced to confront the realities of its own fragility.